So changing these 4 camera settings dramatically improved my photography. So if you're just getting started on your photography journey and you just picked up a DSLR or mirrorless camera and you're not exactly satisfied with the results that you're getting, I've got 4 camera settings that you need to change so that you can dramatically improve the photography and the photos that you're taking. The first one is actually Aperture Priority. Years ago, when I first started my photography journey with a Canon T3i that I picked up used, I took to YouTube to try and figure out what the heck photography is and how to use this camera that I just spent a bunch of money on. And everybody was basically saying mostly the same things. They were just saying that you needed to shoot manual mode, and they're not wrong. Being able to control your camera and change the settings so that you can have the most control over the scene in front of you is very important. But I spent several years turning dials and changing settings completely unnecessarily or without need. I shot so many years in manual mode, and I still do when the need arises, but for the most part, I was only changing one variable of the exposure triangle. I would set my aperture, I would set my ISO, and as the scene changed or as I worked around the property at a photo session, whatever, the only variable that I was changing consistently was the shutter speed. That is until I was challenged by somebody on Threads to basically try Aperture Priority again with the knowledge and with the skills that I have over a 10-year career. And I can tell you that I have not looked back since. The speed at which understanding and using Aperture Priority has allowed me to work through photo sessions is a game changer. I set my aperture where I want it to, and I set my ISO value where I want it to, and the camera, based upon the exposure compensation, sets the shutter speed for me. The only thing that I need to do at this point is to be mindful of not allowing it to drop below a certain shutter speed to freeze action or a shutter speed that I couldn't handhold and still have a sharp photo. So again, I set my aperture, I set my ISO, and I simply adjust the exposure compensation throughout the session as needed. And the camera does the rest. So moving on to the next setting that I think you should change is shooting in burst mode. I believe you should shoot in burst mode probably more often than you are. So how many times have you been on location, you thought you captured this moment, then you realize that you didn't the second you get it in the computer and you start looking at the photos? Or perhaps your subject blinked right when you pressed the shutter, or any number of things. This is where high-speed burst can really come in handy. And that's exactly why I still use burst mode probably 90% of the time. I probably use it in scenarios that I could get away with not, but storage is cheap, and I would prefer to have to sift through more images, but give myself the best opportunity of capturing the moment. So that's why I still shoot burst mode. An added benefit to shooting burst mode is I can't tell you the number of times when I was first starting out in photography, I would get a nice looking composition. I would really enjoy the framing that I had. I would fire the frame thinking I captured this beautiful moment, and then I get it in the camera and I realize that they're not making a pleasing face. Perhaps they are frowning. Any number of things that would make this photo far less impactful. But if you shoot in burst mode, you give yourself a far greater chance of actually getting that great image. It takes you from a good image to that great image because it allowed you to get that one moment where that person just barely cracked that smile versus missing it if you just shot a single frame. Again, storage is cheap, and I'm a big proponent of burst mode. So don't be afraid to change your camera into burst mode and give yourself the best opportunity to capture that moment. Oh, and by the way, hyperlapses are really cool reels and TikToks because you get to show, a moment transpiring, whereas you don't allow yourself that opportunity if you only shot a single frame. Okay, moving on to the next setting that I think you should change, and it's your ISO, which, as you probably know, is simply one of the 3 variables within the exposure triangle. So you're probably wondering, how does changing my ISO improve my photography? When I was first starting out in photography and trying to learn this exposure triangle, all the information said that you needed to shoot the lowest ISO possible so that you could have the cleanest image. And that's a true statement. Obviously, the higher ISO you use, the more noise you may possibly introduce into your image. But for me, as someone who was just starting out, this was crippling because I was so afraid to change my ISO past like 400 that it inevitably left me in situations shooting way too low of a shutter speed, and oftentimes meant that I didn't get a sharp image because my subject moved or whatever, all because I was afraid to move my ISO value. And so this is where my photography started to improve, was when I finally allowed myself to go above ISO 400. Now, here's the caveat. Every single camera is going to be different. More entry-level cameras are going to struggle at higher ISO values than a $6,500 camera body. So what I suggest is that you figure out where your specific camera handles ISO, or at what value your ISO becomes unusable. So for instance, with my Canon 5D Mark III, I was able to find at a wedding reception, once I had gotten all the photos that I needed, I played around because it was a very dark reception. I said, I'm going to take my flash off. Let me figure out how high I can get my ISO and still have a usable / acceptable image. And I was able to find that I was able to use 5,000 ISO very cleanly. Probably could have used it even more, but all that to say, I tested it and I knew that that specific camera body could cleanly deliver acceptable images at ISO 5000. So find that limit for your camera. That way you know it. And if you find yourself with too slow of a shutter or a blurry subject, bump that ISO, give yourself a faster shutter, and get that good photo. So last on the list of camera settings that I think you should change is continuous focus. Most camera manufacturers are going to have at least 2 focus modes, some more, but basically they're going to have single point autofocus and continuous autofocus. Canon calls it AI servo. And so learning the difference between these two and learning the scenarios in which you should use one over the other, over the other is really going to benefit you in the long run. For years, I almost exclusively used single point autofocus with a focus and recompose method, and I still am very comfortable with that methodology even with my mirrorless cameras today. But learning how to use continuous autofocus was very, very, very beneficial for me. For the most part, as a rule of thumb, if your subject is moving, so if you're shooting sports, or if the subject is walking to you, away from you, possibly even a simple twirl, then that means that the distance between your subject and the front of your lens is changing. You should probably be using continuous autofocus for that, because the distance is continually changing, which means that your camera should be continually focusing for you. By allowing your camera to continually focus and track this subject, it gives yourself a far better chance at capturing a sharp and in-focus moment versus if you were just using single point and your subject moved 6 inches. Now that photo's soft and you can't use it. So allowing your camera to continually focus as you're shooting, so long as your camera has decently reliable autofocus, which most modern cameras do, you are going to greatly improve the number of photos that are out of focus. Or let me rephrase that. You're going to have far less photos that are out of focus, which is going to in turn make your job a lot easier, and you'll ultimately end up with better photos. So be sure to practice with those different focus modes. That way you can know the differences and know which scenarios you should use single focus versus the scenarios in which you should use continuous autofocus. Now, at the end of the day, there are absolutely zero shortcuts to becoming a better photographer. You literally have to shoot, make mistakes, learn from them, and repeat. You have to practice and you have to just continually get better. But by understanding and being aware of these 4 settings, you should be able to curb that learning curve just a little bit. And if you have any questions about anything that I've said throughout this video, be sure to put them in the comments below and I will do my absolute best to answer them. Oh, and stick around and subscribe. There'll be a subscribe button, down bottom right of this video. No different than any other video that you've ever watched on YouTube. Yeah, be sure to hit it. or smash it or whatever the kids do, if that's something that you're into. If not, that's also okay. I won't force you to, but I would appreciate it if you did. And on that note, keep shooting, and we'll catch you guys in the next one. So be sure to practice with those different focus modes and know when to use which one so that you can be a better photographer. So practice with those different focus modes so that you can